We can get started with any announcements coming up for SMCI. Thank you to everybody who submitted your papers for being judged in our SMCI contest. Are there any other announcements before we get started?
Katie, I'll put it in the chat, but I'll put a link in for those interested in submitting for the round 2 of the Lilly Donnelly Seed Grants to improve child and maternal health. I'll put that in the chat as well. And Ame she'll put in the chat a few times, CME, how to get CME credit for this lecture as well. Thank you, Ame. Ame is filling in for Selena today, so shout out to Ame for helping us.
Thank you, Ame. Yes, definitely. The Lilly and Donnelly grants are going to be due towards the end of January. This is the second round. So yes, please consider applying. And great. And I see we've already got the CME chat. Well, thank you everybody for being here. We are so excited to have Dr. Paul Helgerson chatting with us. He is a hospitalist and section head of hospital medicine at UVA. I honestly, I think I find most impressive, he was one of the best doctors in America on the best doctors in America list in 2019, 2020. I know that's not what you're going to talk about, Paul, but I know this group from a quality improvement standpoint would love to know what you did that got you there. Dr. Helgerson attended Duke as an undergraduate, received his medical degree from Georgetown, and drumroll please, completed residency at Stanford. So we're excited to have him back home. He also did a fellowship at UC San Francisco, and we're glad to have him back home to chat with us today. So Paul, I will hand it over to you, and then you can chat for a while. If anybody wants to put questions or comments in the chat, I'll be monitoring the chat, but otherwise we'll wait until your invitation, Paul, to jump in with questions.
Right on. Sounds great. And I do want to thank the group for the invitation, and it's particularly fun to come back home in a manner of speaking. I see some familiar names and faces out there in the crowd, if you will. So thank you for joining, and I look forward to catching up at some point. But building on your kind introduction, I think one way to put it is that my present operational role here at the University of Virginia is that I'm the Associate Chief Medical Officer for inpatient operations. And in that role was the guy that a couple of years ago had been approached by our C-suite to say, listen, our length of stay is too long. What can you do to help fix it? And I think that problem has been presented to healthcare leaders in almost every hospital, recently, with increasing urgency given the capacity constraints that we had. And so what I'm presenting today about is my day job, right? Which is how we went about addressing a facet of that I found particularly intriguing. And I hope in so doing to exemplify one or two other things as at least having done pretty well, which is how to wed an operational organizational priority with some scholarship effort and local improvement technique, and sort of combine those things. And so with that, I'll go ahead and Lisa could keep me honest if I'm sharing my screen here, right? Are you seeing a full screen view now? Give me a thumbs up. All right. So the hardest part about this talk was naming it, but what we're going to be focusing on today is really thinking about a very vulnerable population of patients, which is those that are effectively stuck in the hospital. So of all our long length of stay patients, of all our length of stay problem, I would say at University of Virginia, when we tease that apart, what we ended up figuring out is that it was roughly a 50-50 split of extra days that were largely accrued by patients that were there for maybe an extra 24 hours or so, where if we focused on the right processes and effected a more timely discharge, we could save a day here and there, the onesie-twosie kind of things. What I'm going to be talking about is the other group, right, which is those that tend to get stuck for often very long periods of time because there's no suitable alternate level of care. There's very complex psychosocial issues going on. There's often a lot of medical overlay that make them sort of, for lack of a better term, a round peg for a square hole in any next step of their care. And the assertion here is going to be that that's a particularly big problem because it's not good for anybody, most particularly the patient, which is those patients are often a very vulnerable group of people that can't then get what they need, and are effectively stuck in the system, accruing things that aren't really good for their own care. So we're going to talk a little bit about how common this is. We're going to try to always keep it in a patient-centered context. I hope that by the end of the next half hour or so, I'll be able to have convinced you that there are some promising solutions that happen at a number of different orbitals in our various systems, sort of local to grander, and ultimately think a little bit about how we can collectively advocate to do better still. There are a couple, while there's no disclosures, a couple of important acknowledgments. Part of what I'll be presenting is some effort that Mara Ban and Nick Mayo at the University of Washington helped lead, including Mara, who's authored and participated in a couple other versions of this talk. And I also want to acknowledge that I'm really presenting the work of a lot of people locally here that actually are the ones that are rolling up the sleeves and doing this on a daily basis in care management and nursing and a lot of the care navigation. And it just feels wrong not to acknowledge them as we talk through some of these stories. So my guess is that if you read this vignette, that this is going to sound familiar. That most of us, if we're involved in leadership in our organizations, have a number of folks that are on a medicine service or on an inpatient service that resemble this 57-year-old man who came in with infectious endocarditis and osteomyelitis, needed a lot of medicine to stabilize, but in continuation of his care needs multiple weeks of IV antibiotics. But has proven hard to advance to a next level of care because despite the fact that he's nominally eligible, a previous history of incarceration, a relatively disadvantageous Medicaid funding, recent drug use, though now on methadone, has led to him being declined at 25 different skilled nursing facilities in the area. And this all happens on a day where you, as the leader of this environment, also receive a page from your administration saying, please hurry up and discharge people because the hospital is over full, right? And one of the things I found appealing about this case, which is closely based on a true story, is that the patient is theoretically unplaceable. And there's even been recent progress in the world, like, the passage of legislation that skilled nursing facilities, have prescribing rights for things like, methadone or Suboxone or other things for various facets of this patient's care. It's not that it technically can't be done, it's just isn't, right? So how do we advocate for a patient like this? And so the first question is just, does this sound familiar? Do you also have this patient in your hospital? And I will, in a not rhetorical, but more silent way, ask you to think about, so what are the other vignettes that, as much as they might feel relatively unique because there's not one problem, but often 4 or 5 bundled into one case, are nonetheless themes that play themselves out from month to month, such that it feels like you sort of have a Groundhog Day feeling about these cases as they come up. So, make a mental note of those, and we may find ourselves revisiting a couple of those themes as we go on. Now, over a decade and a half ago now, Doctors Rubin and Tonetti, I think, wrote a compelling opinion piece in the New England Journal where they coined a term, right? They called this the hospital-dependent patient. And, really, I think it's best summarized in the way they've stated here, which is that the healthcare system, in all its advances, has a way of sort of creating a small but very impactful cohort of patients that face a really difficult medical, ethical, and practical predicament in which they're so sick that it's hard for them to live anywhere other than a hospital. But even in that same acute care infrastructure's eyes, don't always belong there. That there's sort of the pressures are to advance them to a different level of care in a skilled nursing facility, in an assisted living facility, but they're either frequently readmitted or often sort of the system is at odds with itself over where they best belong. In a more practical way, an article out of Denver Health came out about a decade ago that summarized a number of those themes that tend to continue to present themselves despite the fact that they can feel relatively unique. And I loved this article. The table on the right, I won't read through, but despite the fact that it's inexplicably devoid of punctuation, is very descriptive in terms of the various themes that come up, right? Which is, a lot of these are legal issues. And things like guardianship that takes forever and can often keep patients entrapped in a hospital for months on end as we wait for the legal system to catch up to the medical system. I recently discharged a patient after 128 days of waiting for guardianship when she never needed medical admission, but she'd been arrested with dementia, having tried to drive around her neighborhood and caused a lot of thankfully non-injurious disturbance, brought to the hospital, and there was just no place to send her, right? A lot of this is financial, a lack of a payer for relatively medically ill patients that don't have a means of funding for often complicated things, transportation to and from dialysis from a skilled nursing facility in a place that it otherwise doesn't have a nursing facility that can support that. A lot of behavioral management things paint us into a corner, right? One of the honestly most frequent, albeit one that we don't think about building systems around. I left a meeting literally in the last hour where we were talking about how we were going to place a patient that is now needs a level of care for a skilled nursing facility, but has a history of being on the sex offender registry. And the laws and policies are such that they can't go to a skilled nursing facility. What do you do when you're literally between a rock and a hard place or have no appropriate option? Issues of medical complexity, issues of these other sorts of geographic point of origin and getting trapped in between various systems also tend to repeat themselves again and again. So, for those of you who I ask, what are the themes that play themselves out? My guess is you found one or two of these themes on this table, and these are the types of patients that we're talking about. And I'll revisit the idea that part of my concern is that in addition to accounting for half the bed days lost as it relates to stability to go somewhere else, this is a vulnerable set of patients if you think about the comorbidities that land you in this circumstance. And if we don't think about it in a patient-centered context, we really risk causing a lot of harm. Now, my colleagues Nick and Mara had done a fair amount of work a few years ago to characterize that type of harm. So as you, in a often functionally limited patient tends to accrue a lot of additional bed days, this leads to a lot of different things. Medication error is the most common. Various hospital-acquired conditions that are no good for patients, pressure ulcers, loss of functional mobility, CAUTIs, CLABSIs, these sorts of things tend to come up. But a lot of it is, further social isolation. It's hard to be stuck in a hospital where the cast of characters rotates every shift, and you're living out a half a year of your life in that environment. And so advocating for patients in that environment is often very difficult. It can lead to a lack of clinical inertia. It can lead to a lack of goal concordant care. It can lead to a lot of anxiety on the part of those patients. So if I've convinced you that from a patient-centered standpoint, that would be a problem, then one question is exactly how common is it? And so, if heads are sort of metaphorically nodding that one or more of those vignettes might sound familiar, we did some work to both turn to the literature and to then look at our own institution and other institutions as to how common this is. And similar to so many other trends in healthcare utilization, a very small minority of patients are occupying a lot of the resource, if you will. So in this case, the outlier cases are not only long, but getting longer. And what was found in the studies listed below is that the outlier cases stayed a lot longer than one might imagine. That to be defined as a true top couple percent outlier, that often involves staying something like a month longer and costing many, many thousands of dollars more than a patient that is sort of within the thick part of the Vizient curve. So this is, a group again that not only experiences more hospital complications, more hospital-acquired infections, but also impacts the care team and the cost of care within the system. A lot of provider burnout, a lot of patient dissatisfaction, in addition to the obvious capacity and operational constraints that it puts upon the system from a utilization perspective. I'm not going to dwell on this slide, but I did want to acknowledge that one of the issues here is that measuring it is hard. Um, the names differ. Is this prolonged length of stay, prolonged hospitalization? These are length of stay outliers. How are we calculating that? Is it beyond a certain number of days, which can be measured in real time? Is it beyond a certain predicted length of stay based upon a diagnosis group, a specific diagnosis, a certain set of comorbidities? That's often not knowable until a patient has been discharged and then sort of indexed in some way. There are utilization management criteria in which we look at things that we typically refer to as avoidable days. Um, and then within a given system, it's sometimes more hardwired than others, whether or not we're actually designating days as a patient being still in need of medical care versus stable for a lower level of care. And so even within a given system, sometimes we have a hard time measuring how many of these days fall into the bucket of not necessary, or at least arguably not necessary. So in an ideal world, it would be better defined, consistently measured, and less gray than it often is when we sort of draw the line between medically necessary and not. Conceptually, I think that we could identify that there's sort of a couple different types of delay or non-value added day across the arc of an inpatient admission, right? So a lot of that is, once admitted, there can be delays in the progression of care, but care still medically needed before discharge. My favorite is things like surgical delays. I admit a patient with unstable angina, I have to wait 3 days for their cabbage, but then they get it. I've accrued 3 non-value added days, but that patient wasn't dischargeable. For purposes of simplicity of thought, what we're really talking about is, what happens between, that gray box at the top, so the patient becoming medically stable for discharge and the actual discharge itself. And those two, they can overlap, but they often are to an extent conceptually distinct. Mara and Nick and I undertook in an article that ended up getting published this year in the Journal of Hospital Medicine to look at exactly how common this is if we had a pretty rigorous definition around the patients that are the most stuck. And so our purpose here was to really look at just what's the prevalence through a simple point in time count. We tried to, I'm not much of a researcher, so we tried to keep this as sort of simple as possible. Recruited 16 sites in academic medical centers, and we were looking at general medicine services in each of these places, and really asking a question that's not just who didn't need to be here today, but who is medically stable for discharge and has been medically stable for discharge for at least a week, with the idea that we wanted that to be sensitive enough to really separate out this second group of patients, the ones that had sort of are stuck in the system, not just, became dischargeable overnight and don't meet utilization management criteria anymore. And you see here, what we found is that about 35% of the patients on these medicine services were actually deemed medically stable for discharge on the day that we surveyed them. But when you really drill down to those that had been stuck for longer periods of time, is that in that sort of second column, that across all sites, it was about 10% that had been medically ready for a week or longer. So 1 in 10 patients that are in, general medicine services in our academic medical centers have not only don't need to be there, but haven't needed to be there for a while, as long as there was a suitable next site of care. Now, I should underscore that last part, as long as there was a suitable next site of care, because this doesn't mean that we're simply failing to act on an easily executable discharge. It often means that that next site of care doesn't exist, or for some reason there's a very difficult move to constraint in order to create the ideal environment for that patient. So thinking about how we take that on in an individualized approach or way is really the trick. Now, descriptively, who are these patients? Well, the vast majority of them, about 85%, were heavily dependent on their care environment for ADLs or IADLs. So it's a functionally very limited group of patients. cognitively and behaviorally, I think it's worth noting that almost 20% were waiting on something from the legal system, a court-appointed guardian, for example, or some legally executed appointment of a decision maker. And a full third required some sort of geropsychiatric support. So dementia with behavioral disturbance is the single commonest diagnosis that falls into this group, for which the U.S. healthcare system often just doesn't have a good example. The facility that they most need, one that could provide great continuity of care and psychiatric or geropsychiatric expertise, is simply unavailable in the care environment. Roughly another third, and these can be overlapping thirds, had a major financial barrier, were simply uninsured for what they might most need with a sort of a non-existent payer. As we complete sort of the evidence review side of this, it's a single center study up not too far from most of you folks up at San Francisco General that Molly Rosenthal led. And this looked at patients that is a similar cohort that had at least 3 days of what here would be an alternate level of care. So were felt to no longer need acute hospitalization. The arc of each of those admissions in this figure is depicted in blue when they needed the medical side, and the yellow when they had stabilized from a medical side and were waiting to graduate to a downstream level of care. So you see a whole lot of yellow there. And I think one of the things that I found most interesting about this is that about a third of the patients in that bucket counted for about 90% of all those alternate level of care days. So, and again, managing the outliers is a big deal here. It's a relatively small group of patients that accounts for a huge number of bed days of care. So the question then becomes like, so what do these patients need? And am I just describing a problem, or is there a solution set to describe of how we might take this on and really affect a different equilibrium where those patients get what they need in a more timely way and everybody's happy? So to walk through that with you, I'll pick a second case, which is also based on a true story here. An 85-year-old gentleman that showed up with progressive cognitive decline. He had had a prior stroke. He was admitted with pneumonia and hyponatremia. And over the first week of hospitalization, his condition stabilized. So he's now medically ready. However, he'd had multiple lengthy admissions in that year. He lacked Medicare coverage for further skilled nursing care because he'd already burned through his quote unquote covered Medicare days, and he didn't have any long-term care coverage. So basically our hospital had gotten paid for 5 days of medical care on a DRG, and now there's no more reimbursement. He's stuck in the hospital, and since he didn't have decision-making capacity, and he had a legally very complex problem, which is that the only resources he had were tied up with several other brothers that lived out of state, 2 of whom also had dementia. So basically he had terribly illiquid resources such that he didn't qualify for Medicaid, was stuck in the hospital, and no way to liberate those resources to his own benefit. So it took us 200 days to solve this problem, ultimately at our own facility's expense, which is to pay for him to go to a skilled nursing facility and continue care as he got further medical legal aid. And I'm going to come back to that community medical legal aid as a potential solution that's been common across a number of more successful medical centers. But this is the type of patient that we're talking about where those bed days go, right? Who's, if I divide through by a typical length of stay, if I were able to solve that problem in a very timely way, I could care for about 20 other patients, from what I've accrued within that problem. And again, if I were able to progress this patient through quicker, it would be to everyone's benefit that he did not do well having a rotating cast of characters caring for him versus a more home-like environment that might be better suited to avoid some of those complications mentioned. So I'll ask a question for your own reflection here, which is that since you represent several different sites of care, which of the following resources are available at your own health system? Do you have an organized complex discharge team that takes these problems on and is resourced to solve them? Are there resources such as medical respite care, medical legal aid, funds for sponsored skilled nursing home care that would help a gentleman like I just described? Because those end up being the countermeasures that have been most impactful for populations like this. And I'll review each of them, quickly. But really thinking about it conceptually is something that has a lot of different levels to it if we solve this problem. What can we as health systems do internally? What do we rely upon in partnership with our community? And then what do we need governmental support for? Not just from a payment angle, but also from things like changing the way partnerships with courts work, or partnerships with state mental health institutions where we can do better patient triage or other things to solve, everyone's problems in a more organized fashion. Um, every couple slides, I want to remind myself to stay focused on the patient and the team, and not just the financial benefit of the health system, right? So a lot of this is thinking about a couple of different quadrants here, where we want to be thinking about providing higher quality of care, improving the team's well-being, improving that patient's experience, and lowering cost through that triple or quadruple aim all the while. And so as we anchor in that, we think what we did is that we'd had for years what we called the complex discharge team. But what that really was is I felt more of a facility biased, how do we get patients out of the system quicker, complex discharge team. And what we first undertook to do is to think about that through a patient-centered equity lens. How do we sort of balance this in a way that is likely to accomplish, the most of what we'd accomplish on that last slide? So we wanted to make sure that we were able to funnel as many patients into that system as we could. And I'm going to stay largely away from the topic of exactly what criteria a facility sets for how patients get into the system, and think more about some principles, which is that it's generally not about waiting for some arbitrarily long length of time in order to start solving these problems, right? Only the patients that have been here 2 weeks, but rather finding screening criteria that relates to medical complexity, social determinants, financial problems, that right up front we can make sure that those patients are identified, and that an informed and well-resourced group of people is beginning to work on how to solve it. That group needs to meet regularly. There often is a fair amount of subject matter expertise involved. In our case, we created a dedicated role, a case manager that was very experienced, that managed nothing but, the way I put it to her is that she only skis black diamonds, right? Managed nothing but cases that, sort of fall into this group. Um, and we wanted to make sure that they were resourced, so that we had a relatively large pool of charitable funds that we could draw from, that there was, we wrote some rules about in terms of how we could equitably access. So there's some discretionary funding. Can you build a wheelchair ramp? Can you modify a patient's home? Can you, provide skilled nursing facility care if you had to? That we had access to rapid authorization for whatever that group needed to do, and then tried to be very thoughtful about the membership of that group, that it included not just the case management and social work leadership, um, physician leaders, but are there leaders from ethics, from representation, from finance, a sensitive voice from palliative care, to make sure that we're barking up the right tree in terms of placement versus recalibration of goals. And finally, that we were including more partners in this. So, can we bring our partners in and think about, gosh, if we're wishing that we could adapt that skilled nursing facility or assisted living environment, how are they willing to adapt to share a mutual purpose? I think there's certain things that was a ground that we haven't covered yet. So, for example, could we get to a point where there's a patient representative and community representative? Can we bring our county mental health services into this? Can we bring, ombuds folks from the community and in that SNF world? So that's very much a work in progress. We found that as it relates to the physician partnership in that, or the partnership with the clinical teams caring for these patients, there were a couple things that proved particularly important. One is that there was sort of a respected clinical voice in the team, that it is sort of a second opinion, because these are invariably the agonizing cases, the ones that you're going home feeling like you don't know how to affect a different, sort of equilibrium for that patient. And so to have a second opinion there that could offer peer support, validate that they were operating sort of consistently within institutional norms, and frankly provide a little bit of a system of checks and balances, that what we're doing is equitable, is patient centered, is sort of the way we'd want it to be done, ends up being really important. There's also, I think, a much more practical piece of this, which is just the just-in-time education that needs to be involved, right? So there's a lot of nuances to what one might be able to do in terms of specific facilities that have specific needs, or specific services to offer. Can we make sure that that education is available to our clinical teams? Um, Joan is the case manager that has taken on a lot of this work locally at UVA. I included this, and I'm sorry to make you squint or read particularly fast, but the reason I wanted to include it is to try to validate that this can be done in a way that that feels to everyone patient-centered. That this is a testimonial based on the input post-discharge of a patient that was with us for quite a while. He was a gentleman in his 40s that had relatively severe autism, and unfortunately found himself, after admitted for medical reasons, rapidly stabilized with no community facility in a position that they felt they could take him back, and was sort of orphaned in our system. And it really required some pretty tireless advocacy to work with a variety of community partners to sort of create a solution, a living environment that worked for him. But to the great satisfaction or pleasure of his sister, who was a wonderful care partner in her own right. Um, Different institutions have begun to innovate in this space. One of the ones that got published about a decade ago was what Dartmouth Hitchcock took on, as they took on this relatively small but very impactful group of patients that needs guardianship. They looked at the patients requiring guardianship and found that over a period of a couple of years that cost about a month per patient, and about $150,000 per patient in terms of what health systems ended up taking on, and that with a clinical pathway that was recognized to identify patients that might be in need of something like that early, we're able to cut that in about half to the great savings of a health system. The question is, what does it take to do that? And as we sort of took that on here at UVA and asked ourselves, sort of how could we create the right sort of resource for patients in that group, or the right sort of resource for a patient like ours, who in this vignette that I just presented had needed medical or needed help in order to liberate his own financial resources to pay for his own care. That what that really involved was a different type of attorney that I'm used to working with, right? Not the hospital side attorneys about what we're allowed to do and what we aren't, but a much more patient-centered view of how do we basically make sure that we have at, at readily accessible to our own patients a patient side legal representation and advocacy that can help with those civil legal needs, that are often the key to a safer versus less safe discharge. So that's pretty rangy in terms of what that might look like. Sometimes it's advocacy against a pending eviction. Sometimes it's denial of benefits that can be overcome. Sometimes it's liberating financial resources, or taking care of civil legal needs like guardianship proceedings or other things like I just mentioned. It turns out that there's a lot of resource for this. George Washington University sponsors a center about medical legal partnerships. Um, but that's the San Francisco General, for example, has done a good job of this, partnering with both the city and local law schools. They were of great benefit to us in setting up our own arrangement. We ended up going through not so much our own law school, but our community legal aid justice center to find an attorney that was very interested in partnering with us and joining into sort of a weekly call in which we'd identified needs. And she's proven just an invaluable resource in taking on some of these things on the behalf of many of our patients in greatest need. Um, Another resource that we concentrated on was medical respite. That my colleagues at Harborview had found that they face, problems in advocating for a population of homeless patients that is large enough that they'd invested in a facility that Harborview operated to provide medical respite with some skilled care. At UVA, we found that we didn't really need that. Our homelessness problem is smaller than it is in a larger city, but nonetheless very impactful. And what we found is that there were many patients that would come into our system and were in need of a safe, secure, restful environment, access to meals, access to clean places that they could do things like dressing changes, but not in need of inpatient care. Um, and medical respite, broadly defined, it can take on a lot of different dimensions, from that safe space all the way to things that have much more skilled care involved. But how that ends up getting sort of resourced at a local level can often be a community partnership. It can often be a charitable partnership. It can often be health system sponsored. In our case, we had charitable funding, in which we did is we partnered with a local hotel very near an outreach clinic that we run as an institution, and we sponsor on average of about 4 patients at any given time. to live in a hoteled environment, while then we deliver home health and other services to that environment before they graduate to a number of other housing situations. And it's been transformative in what it's take to solve various problems where patients that didn't want to be in the hospital but needed transitional care were able to seek it. Um, I put this up here as a plug for the National Institute that also has a lot of resources for those looking to explore what more formal respite environments or arrangements might look like, and some props to the state of California that recently invested a bit more resource in the direction of building these programs out. Um, One of the more common solutions is health system SNF partnerships that various health systems have created, often relatively unique ones, to solve these very specific diagnosis-based needs. I can't say that we've been successful on all of these fronts. We have a very fledgling geropsychiatric partnership. Um, I have colleagues at other facilities that have been more successful than we have been at UVA at building out addiction treatment and other medication-assisted therapy programs at skilled nursing facilities. I have colleagues in New York who have built out advanced cardiac care in skilled nursing facility environments for graduates of many of their more advanced programs. And what we've seen is that that's often helped some of these patients, graduate to specialty environments more quickly. The more common arrangement is simply a financial one. Is do facilities have contracted beds or other patient-specific contract skilled nursing facility support in place that if finances alone are the barrier, they can more rapidly act on arrangements that allow us to meet a patient's care needs. This is something that we've become accustomed to doing much more commonly, and has taken on a bunch of different dimensions to, bridging a patient, in a skilled nursing facility as they seek Medicaid, all the way over to things like charitable funds. Like we recently, for example, had a bariatric patient that we widened their doorway at home to get a bariatric wheelchair through in order for them to return to their home care environment, versus need for a skilled nursing facility for which they didn't have benefits. Right. I think the question is really, how quickly can you do that? Is it sort of an act of Congress within a facility, or is there there's a mechanism through a care team that allows you to be flexible enough to be able to do that relatively promptly, and to distribute those resources and with sort of a rubric that feels equitable to the many patients that access our care. Um, so, if I had to describe where we are right now, we've seen a fair amount of early progress and still a ton of opportunity in our local improvement efforts that have focused on those teams. So we've created a number of different programs to look at, home care for patients with dementia. We've done a lot of work on mobility to try to avoid instances where functional decline is the main driver when that was predictable over the course of an admission. We've recreated workflow for the complex discharge team to make sure that we're really making sure that we're identifying the right patients early on. We've had these innovative, I think, partnerships with local sort of hotels with a lot of medical resource coming in that has helped a fair amount of patients. And we've begun to begin some post-acute partnerships for certain patient populations, building out peritoneal dialysis capability, building out capability by helping resource one local facility to deliver more ideal care to patients with morbid obesity, which had otherwise typically been declined in our community, despite medical eligibility. The question that I think is probably on a lot of your minds is, all right, so does this actually work? And one thing I wanted to talk through is how difficult it can be to measure, and how hard it is to see unless one is deliberately measuring. Right. So what we ended up doing, and on this slide I compare the quarter four of 22 versus quarter four of fiscal year 23, because we found that there was a fair amount of seasonal variation of folks getting stuck in the system as capacity in our skilled nursing environment and other things varied season to season, COVID epidemic to COVID epidemic, or COVID surge, I should say, to COVID surge. And what we found is that as we first got into this work, we created a cutoff where we looked retrospectively at anybody that had been in the system for more than 3 times their Vizient predicted length of stay by diagnosis, right? So these were patients that didn't have just an extra day or two in the system, but had stayed a fair amount longer, and that's depicted in red. And if I ask you just to compare left to right there, how much area is in red? My guess is that it would be hard to eyeball that there's any difference at all. And, in the first couple months of launching into our improvement work, we found that, in fact, it wasn't dramatically different, that we'd gone from 11% of our bed days that were incurred in those sorts of outlier cases to about 9.5%. So was there a sliver of hope? And we still weren't sure if we were measuring it the right way. We then looked at it just to compare at similar graphs, but the cutoff here just being patients that stay longer than 14 days. So we wanted to look at it in real time so that we knew if we were making any progress. Um, but is that area under the curve and the tail getting any different? And again, to eyeball, I think most of it would say, gosh, it doesn't really seem that different. But when you look harder at the numbers, what we found is we use that as a threshold and, FY23 quarter 1, fiscal year quarter 1, so this would have been more summer than winter months, that we'd had about 8,000 days above threshold at that 14-day cutoff. But employing a lot of these different techniques and in a much more organized effort, same quarter in the next fiscal year, we'd gotten all the way down to 5,600 bed days beyond, right? So a pretty big difference, right? Saving, 2,000 plus bed days of care in the same quarter with some very focused efforts, and just that tail that to the eyeball is really, really hard to see. And I think to me, one of the lessons there is that progress does need to be measured and is hard to see, because a lot of these patients ended up get dismissed as the one-off. You can't possibly organize an effort to solve for that, because it's usually sort of this seemingly unique complicated mess of things. But in fact, these patterns do repeat themselves and are a valuable target for improvement when you think about the amount of capacity that thousands of bed days is in our system. I'm going to end, my side of this by just a quick plug that I don't think that we should leave rather the advocacy or governmental side of this alone. That as we looked at this with a couple of my collaborators, we had some success, both big and small, that I'll address in just 1 minute or two. That, for example, one of the things we'd noted at UVA was that we were seeing a lot of patients that were sent in from an assisted living facility that then refused to take them back, that in our opinion at least, felt like for reasons that were debatable, right? That it was more out of convenience than true inability to accommodate, and might not be an ethical thing to do for someone whose home that was. And in fact, in partnership with the Virginia legislature, we're able to tighten legislation that mandated ombudsperson involvement in much clearer criteria for when eviction was appropriate without external review. It does seem to have helped that not becoming a problem where patients are basically getting stuck in hospital for reasons that are really, potentially not fair to them. During the pandemic, my colleagues at Harborview had a sort of a much bigger effort play itself out, as it was recognized that so many patients were getting stuck in the system at a time where hospitals simply didn't have the capacity to meet demand, that the state stepped in with $90+ million worth of aid to really think through what different might look like. And one of the things I found interesting about that is that recently I saw, for example, some legislation and advocacy from the American Medical Association about paying more for patients that are stuck in the system so that hospitals don't go broke taking care of this population, which in my mind was probably a well-intentioned effort biased toward acute care institutions that doesn't fundamentally solve the problem, that's not where those patients are best suited to be. It keeps acute care hospitals from going broke, but it doesn't actually solve the problem of affecting more reasonable disposition and better long-term care environment. And so in this case, I think Seattle got it right, which is what they had done is partner with the state to bolster basically the reimbursement that skilled nursing facilities get on a one-time basis for accepting patients of higher complexity into the downstream environment to free up hospital capacity, and that had a positive impact on improving flow through the system. Now, does that endure post-COVID? We'll see if things like that discharge incentive can hold up. But nonetheless, I think a strong rationale with sort of some signal that there are different ways that if we partner with those governmental payers, that we could affect a different equilibrium. So I'm going to take us then ahead to thinking about, in conclusion, what, if we're the clinical team out there, are we supposed to be thinking about as we encounter these cases and we think about how to advocate within our system to do something differently? Well, I think we want to identify those at-risk patients early. We want to make sure we have a structured approach. We want to make sure that that's a patient-centered approach and bring those checks and balances back to ensure that that's the mindset of the team that forms around them. We want to broaden the community resources that we can marshal for more integrated solutions. And finally, not leave alone those advocacy efforts, because we've seen some hope that when we do partner in those spaces, that good does come from it. So with that, I will stop and open it up to your questions, which I really look forward to hearing, because every time I give this talk to an audience outside of UVA, I find that there's one or two facets of this that there's other institutions are already doing better than we are, and I learn a lot. So questions or observations, and thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Paul. And if you can put your video on and give a round of applause, that would be great. Lisa, I saw that you had put a comment in the chat if you want to chime in. And then TJ McGreevy, I think you've also got a question in the chat.
Yeah, it was just a great talk as usual, Paul. Thank you so much. Just so many parallels to, when the VA first got started on trying to end veteran homelessness. And it was just got so obvious that this can't be just a VA-led effort. It has to have community partners. And that was something kind of foreign to the VA. And I don't know how much anyone on this call that or in this lecture series that is working on the Stanford and how much Stanford does or doesn't engage community partners in its efforts to discharge these complex patients. But just kudos to you, for calling that out as a key element, because it's not intuitive and it's not easy to start and maintain, but really essential.
No, thank you, and I agree. And maybe just to get us started, I'll respond to TJ's comment in the chat. That is could there be any conflict with CMS regulations if there's facility owned or operated downstream facility? And I think the answer is, in short, yes, it could be. That, and so you do have to be mindful of some of the Stark Law issues in there, and you also have to be mindful of CMS regulations that say that you're not allowed to just pay for things that are technically benefited services of. So like we found, for example, it's a lot easier to pay for downstream care for patients that are just frankly uninsured than it is a Medicare beneficiary. But at the same time, if it's really about inducement, that you're in conflict with the letter of law, but not really the intent of the law. If what you're doing is trying to pay for a next site of care for a patient that the point isn't to see them back to generate more business, it's in certain ways the opposite. So part of that, I think, facility to facility comes down to more a facility legal interpretation and risk tolerance question, in addition to then, some rules that might differ based upon who's the patient's payer is. And so, what we discovered, and I wouldn't pretend that the answers that we've come to here are the answers for everywhere, but that it is important to have sort of that health system side, legal representation at the table in your problem solving efforts to make sure that the right hand knows what the left hand is doing. But I don't actually think there's a lot of easy answers in that space. I think some of it is a little bit more interpretive than a true letter of the law issue.
Thank you so much, Paul. While we wait for other questions, I just wanted to take the opportunity as well to just note how important it feels like this work seems for the entire system. So for patients, families, clinicians, in terms of feelings of moral distress and even burnout, trying to care for patients who need to be discharged, but then are blocked. This is just a comment. I'm not a clinician, so I'm a qualitative researcher with the Evaluation Sciences Unit. And so tell me if I'm on the wrong track, but it just struck me, it struck me how so much of the work to appropriately discharge patients might often be like unpaid coordinating work that a family would do. And so I'm just curious, how much of the really underlying piece is like a lack of social support for these patients, as that clashes with a system that even like well organized families have to really put kind of all of their resources towards to make it work.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think you're right to point out that there's kind of a couple of orbitals here, right? So one is that this is clearly a lot harder when a patient just doesn't have a care partner or a family that is, sort of resourced in terms of either finances or time or, sort of an ability to navigate the system. So we run into a lot of patients that just don't have that person, or in others that have sort of burned some of those bridges, right? But then we also find that, there's another orbital at which, even if you have that in your family, that you're right, it's hugely demanding of that family to do. And, it might, one solution be to decrease the, so that the cost incurred by those families or other things, if there's a much higher system-wide cost that is then incurred when they're not dealt with, right? Like, why should it be so expensive to get guardianship if the idea then is that, I mean, it's costing us $150,000 every time a patient is sitting in the hospital to do it. That's the sort of societal thing that I mean, I think, it would be great to create more dialogue around. And one of the things that we've been trying to advocate for when, our state's, governmental leaders, sort of swing through the facility to talk about is, can we get any traction? But work in progress.
Definitely. Jill, I see you're unmuted, and then there are a few questions in the chat. I will try and roll those up while Jill, you ask your question.
Thank you so much, Paul. This was very informative. I'm the Executive Director of Case Management and Social Work, so my team is working with these patients every day, and we're facing many of these same challenges or trying to put similar things in place. I think the partnership with payers, because in California with our Medi-Cal, we do have a lot of facilities that absolutely will not take patients because the reimbursement is so low. So we do find ourselves subsidizing sometimes just to get the facility to take the patient. I think also as we have more of an aging population, and people live far away from family members, that hospital in the home or SNP in the home sounds good, but if there's not caregivers at home, it's a hard model to deploy. So interested in any other thoughts of creative solutions for those patients that we also often see in the ED too, where family just cannot care for them. They haven't planned for long-term care. They may not have the funds for long-term care. And there's a need for 24/7 services, with personal care services not being reimbursable, that we just really struggle to find a good solution for those individuals.
Yeah, I mean, I could talk for an hour about that, and I'm not sure I have good solutions. But I mean, I think part of it is that we're a victim of our own stupid rules in terms of, I mean, 3 midnight rules and, other things like that, you just kind of want to get rid of. I think part of it is that there's, the easy thing to say, but the really, really hard thing to do is to do better advanced care planning with patients and families so that, I mean, nobody's caught flat-footed when these things come up. And I mean, that's preaching to the choir, talking to an inpatient person about something that's so diffuse as an outpatient, but in the most vulnerable populations, I mean, in, areas where, I mean, in dementia and stroke and, I mean, other disease states where there's sort of a predictable decline coming, I think we do need to hardwire some systems to think ahead before inpatient placement really becomes the thing. I think, to me, the final thing is that if I could really wish something at a policy level, It's that we'd changed the way SNFs are reimbursed that better accounts for patient complexity,
Yeah.
right? So that, I mean, because they're disincented from taking complex patients right now. You know, you
Right.
fill it up with hip replacements and send them all home, and you're disincented to take the morbidly obese patient. You're disincented to take the medically complex patient. And, you know, so I think in a lot of ways, there is a payment reform component to this, which is advocating to change the rules that better allows for that. But I mean, I realize that that's adjacent but not the same as the problem that you were talking about, right, when they just sort of show up to the ER. But I think it's a combination of all of those things.
Great, thank you.
And Paul, we've mostly got big thank yous in the comments. Anne did have a question in Ellsworth about the initial appetite for setting up the complex discharge team. How different was it from the previous work the team did? Was it more of a coordinated, intentional coming together? I'm guessing it's being asked in terms of like, how do we get there from here?
Well, so I would say there are 3 or 4 things that helped us, right? So one was actually measuring the problem, so that, you know, I mean, and you know, we came, you know, I showed you a couple slides of how we measured it, but we partnered with our local data scientists, and we called it the area under the curve approach. Like, can we actually measure the bed days in the tail there? Which I think helped convince everybody that this wasn't just the 1 or 2 cases that frustrate the heck out of you. It was like, it was a consistent, measurable population of patients that even the unique sounding themes repeated themselves. And so that, you know, to convince everybody that that was worth investing in, right? That's one. I think 2 is, you know, look at, and the reason that we led such a concerted effort to look outside our own institution was that there tended to be this sense that this was, you know, just our local environment was impoverished for resources, or that, you know, I mean, that some of these problems were unsolvable. So as we collected a body of evidence to suggest that no, many of these are solvable with some of these, you know, countermeasures, and that everybody has these problems, I think that there was a growing sense of optimism that as much as it wasn't easy, this is something that if you take the theme on, you are going to make progress. And I do fundamentally believe that. And I think the third, which you know, I appreciated some of the acknowledgement in the comments here, is that I think framing it in a patient-centered approach is absolutely essential. That I think it can be hard for teams like that because they feel like they're told from the C-suite to chase people out of the hospital to really feel motivated to walk into that meeting, right? If that's what it feels like. And so I think you have to feel motivated that you're there to protect a really vulnerable population of patients by it. And I think that also means, and this may be unpopular in some circles, but to say you're going to take a couple losses too. Right. Like I've become a little unpopular lately by really taking a pretty strong voice in one of these discussions to say, no, like, I think we're stuck with this one. Like, I think we're a better place for this patient to be than anywhere that we could potentially leverage them going. And I think you have to enter in with an understanding that occasionally that case is going to come up if you really do it in a patient-centered way. But that if you really take on the comprehensive work, that you're still going to come out ahead.
Paul, thank you so much. We wrap up right at the hour for this group. Again, if you guys can turn on your videos and give a big round of applause. In the chat, there's CME information. In the chat, there's information about Lily and Donnelly. Thank you all so much for being here. And we will see you next time, which I think is, Sam, is it? I think it might be January. Ame, yeah, when is our next?
December 12th, I think.
December 12th. Forgive me, December 12th. We'll see you December 12th. Excellent. Thank you so much, Paul. Great to have you. Thanks, everyone. Take care.